Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ruthie Lieberman, and I am from EMPath, which stands for Economic Mobility Pathways. I'm so happy to greet you today to this webinar called Your Role in the Vote, a training for service providers. I'm going to start by introducing myself and giving you heads up on a couple great things that are happening, and then I'm going to introduce my wonderful colleagues. EMPath is a national organization, nonprofit, that's focused on helping people climb the economic ladder. We do that by providing direct services, by researching and innovating effective strategies for individuals to move out of poverty and to support organizations to do the same. Finally, we're very active in policy advocacy around economic mobility, both at the state level and the national level. And as an organization that does advocacy, we'd like to encourage you to sign up for our free advocacy alerts. We send out no more than one or two very quick actions you can take every month to learn about policies that support economic mobility with easy actions that you can take. And I'd also like to tell you about a very exciting opportunity to join us and our partners in Washington, D.C. next spring for our second Disrupting Poverty Action Summit, May 4th through 5th, 2027. We're particularly interested in having folks with lived experience come and join us in Washington, D.C. to advocate on economic mobility, to meet with your elected officials, and to join in brotherhood and sisterhood to change the way that things work in this country. And without further ado, I want to introduce my wonderful partners in putting on this session today. I thank them so much for coming up with this idea and for being open to us joining together. Before I introduce them, let me just say that I'm actually right at this moment at Fort Ticonderoga in New York, which is a real pivotal place in American history and the fight for democracy in the United States. So I actually am feeling a lot of chills right now for being here and getting to put on with my colleagues this really critical session that focuses on the cornerstone of democracy, which is voting. So I'm going to pass it first I'm pleased to introduce Kamatara, who's the executive director of Circles USA. And you wanted to say hi, Kamatara? Or actually, I'm going to allow you to talk, right? So I'm going to pass it over to Kamatara. I also want to thank Kara, our partner, Kara Baldari, and Kamatara can pass it over to her. But together, we are three great and powerful organizations that are focused on helping individuals and families live a better life. So pass it to Kamatara, and thank you.
And actually, Kara, why don't you introduce yourself and Family Promise first, and then I'll tell you a little bit about Circles and then introduce our speaker.
Great. Thanks so much. It's really great to be here with all of you and really grateful for the partnership with EMPath and Circles USA. For those who don't know me, my name is Kara Baldari. I'm Family Promises Director of Advocacy working in DC. I know we have some Family Promise affiliates on the call, which is really exciting. If you don't know Family Promise, we're a national nonprofit working to prevent and end family homelessness around the country. We have close to 180 sites in nearly 40 states, and our sites operate a continuum of programs to help children and families who are in a housing crisis. We know that families being able to exercise their right to vote is really critical for advancing the long-term change we need to make sure every kid and family has access to safe and stable housing. So we're really grateful to be, again, in partnership with all of you today, and I will pass it to Kamatara.
Thank you so much. And just to echo what Ruthie and Kara have shared, we're so excited to have our peer organizations all working together because we can make such a wave across the United States when we are working together. So my name is Kamatara. I'm with Circles USA, and we are also a national nonprofit dedicated to ending poverty. We do that by building community. So we have two goals at Circles. One is to come alongside families as they leave poverty behind permanently. And the second one is to remove the barriers that keep people in poverty. So that's where we do our systemic change work. So we are that hybrid of direct service providers and advocacy systems changers. And there are about 60 chapters in 22 states. Um, I think that's pretty good. All the websites and beautiful things are all in the chat if you want to start clicking and doing a little more research. But we are so excited to have with us today Evan Preston, who is the Senior Director of Advocacy with the Voting Rights Lab. And Evan has worked on bipartisan election policies and nonpartisan civic education in dozens of states. He is an expert, and I can say, in part, this webinar came about because I know our chapters have been really struggling and asking lots of questions about voting rights because it feels like we're walking uphill on sand, blindfolded in this crazy storm. And it just feels like it keeps changing, and to know what's real and what's not real. And we want to get everyone voting in 2026. So when I was talking with Ruthie and Kara, because we are fabulous partners together in this work, we thought, you know what, we should just do something together. And then we connected with Evan, who agreed to do this presentation. So I'm very grateful that you're here today, Evan. He's going to do his presentation. We'll have some Q&A at the end. And of course, this is being recorded, so you'll be able to come back to it if you need to see it again or share it with folks who weren't here. So I'm going to pass the baton to Evan.
Thank you so much for that wonderful welcome. And thank you for allowing me to be here with all of you. I'll say first, just it's a real pleasure to get to be with you today because while I have something to offer about election policies in the states and your role, I want to thank you for the work you're doing every day to provide essential services to people in your community. As someone who comes from a rural community in Southern Illinois, the service providers in my home county were people like my parents, many of my loved ones. And I just want to thank you for what you're doing every day at the various organizations that are on this call, because while I have something to share about our democracy and the rules that govern it in your role, you really are the foundation for civic life in America. And so thank you for everything you're doing every single day. With that, I can turn now to voting and your roles as service providers and what you can do. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about who Voting Rights Lab is. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit. We emphasize doing cross-ideological partnerships to fully represent everyone, all eligible voters, to represent the interests and concerns of those voters in our work to inform public policy discussions. Our staff include organizers, folks like myself that have a background registering people to vote in many different states around the country. Some of our folks are advocates like me that work with lawmakers. Some of our people are election law experts and lawyers that have a background in writing laws in state legislatures. But we include former election administrators, litigators, voter registration directors, educators, and some of our staff are former social service providers as well. What we do, a few different things to set the stage. We provide real-time tracking of all 50 states' election policy changes. So how have election laws evolved? What do states compare to each other on particular topics? We have interactive tools that will be in some of the links that Maya really helpfully has compiled for our voting rights lab tracker that you can use to monitor changes in your state as lawmakers make changes or as state election bodies are making changes. You can follow along there, along with our newsletters that will track that with nationwide coverage. We also provide narrative tools for serving your members if you're a membership organization and people in your community where you provide services. So we have more to provide on that I'll talk a little bit about later. And then we run trainings for community leaders and for people within your organizations. If you're interested in that, I'll have more to share later about that, but I'll just put briefly a link in the chat now for the next session that anybody could come to if you have members of your organization not on this call who you think might benefit from what I'll share later. We have more trainings to provide to people with state-specific information. But what are we here to talk about today? Questions about voting, questions about how our elections are run, and potential challenges that folks may experience, but also the opportunity for all of you with the tremendous work you're doing every day to help address some of those challenges. But I'd actually, before I say anything more, love to give folks a chance to maybe put in the chat or share what you're experiencing in your communities. If you've seen messages that might raise questions for people that you work with every day or that you serve, and if there's been pressure or challenges in local elections, if there's been confusion about participation, if folks would be willing to share for maybe just a minute, what do you see in your communities? What are the things that have stood out to you and the folks that you serve? Well, just as folks are reflecting on that, I'll move into a few of the things that we've noticed in a few different areas of things that we track. Um, but yes, just seeing to voice over that some folks mentioning questions about voting by mail, how ballots are collected and counted. That's a topic we've seen come up in a number of states. There have been certain legal challenges on that topic that have come up in recent months. Another person is sharing concerns about the polling locations no longer being available. Perhaps that folks were used to visiting if they've been changed by your local election authority. Folks are concerned about gerrymandering. Yep. Great. Well, those are all good examples that kind of preview what I'll have more to share about now. So we track three basic types of threats that might impact how people can exercise their freedom to vote. The first is over the rules for who can register and how they can register to vote. The second is in efforts to weaken very popular vote methods and create chaos and confusion for eligible voters. And the final is laying the groundwork for overturning election results. There are a few things in the first category here on how people can register to vote and who is in charge. One is in redrawing districts, as someone raised in the chat, on the changes to particularly congressional district lines. Second, on proof of citizenship requirements. These are policies at the federal and state level that would require people to present a passport or birth certificate in many cases in order to remain an eligible voter or become a registered voter in that state. We've seen efforts to prohibit or restrict voter registration drives that perhaps organizations on this call have conducted in the past. There have been efforts to change the eligibility requirements pretty dramatically. So say how long you need to live in the state to be a registered voter or other changes like that. There and I see someone sharing in the chat about questions about what IDs are acceptable. Those have been changed in recent years in a number of states. There's also been changes to how election officials review the eligibility of voters and what sources of information they're using. A federal database that has come under legal question recently. And then efforts to threaten and intimidate opposition groups or people who are perceived as being opposed to the current federal administration have come under attack through legal methods. The second kind of potential challenge that folks may be experiencing around cuts to early voting days, hours, and locations, efforts to restrict the mail voting system that many voters rely upon in many states are deeply reliant on, in particular in Western states. There have been efforts to change the ballot return deadlines, including with a recent Supreme Court case that the Supreme Court did not choose to require nationwide changes to ballot return deadlines. There have been efforts to limit third-party ballot returns. And then finally, in the category of laying the groundwork for overturning election results, this is in some ways some of the most disturbing things we've seen in recent years of efforts to introduce discretion or delays to certifying the outcome of an election where we know who the legitimate winner is, but people for their own efforts to keep themselves in power or people that they favor in power have tried to manipulate those rules. There's been efforts to expand the ability of partisan actors to challenge eligible voters and their ballots once they've been cast, in some cases to have them thrown out. There have been efforts to introduce inaccuracy via hand counting, so going ballot by ballot and using human eyes to evaluate that is a more inaccurate and system that opens up the possibility for fraud more so than using a machine tabulator and then verifying that in some cases with hand count reviews. And then there's been efforts to expand power by state or even federal authorities in some cases to take over local election administration. So those are all the challenges, or at least several of them, that folks may be experiencing in their communities. But I have good news for everybody who's here, which is that our system, our form of choosing our own government, is made strong by you and people like you. There are bipartisan teams of people at every level who review the conduct of elections, and there are strong checks and balances at every stage of the process, from registering people to vote, to counting ballots, to certifying the winners of elections, that we can rely upon because it is our neighbors, it is people just like us who are doing that work at the local level, and that is a strength that we can rely upon. Also, the good news is that we have things that all of you, I'm sure, have done some of already, and you are a part of the solution, and that we can equip our neighbors and the people that we serve every day to do. And that's in 3 stages of training volunteers and people to take on the roles that make elections possible, of preparing our communities with conversations and education about what those rules are, and then in being trusted messengers with the people who are in our lives who may have questions. And it's perfectly legitimate and good to ask questions about how elections are run or how a particular election was conducted, or questions that have been posed in the media. That's a good thing to ask those questions. And we can set up people in each of your communities to be prepared to help answer those questions. So diving into those kind of 3 phases. First, in training volunteers. I'd love to see in the chat if folks have done this. I'm sure that some folks perhaps have already, but we really would describe this in a few phases. First is just educating voters about the deadlines, qualifications, ID requirements for themselves to be able to vote. The second thing that equipped volunteers can do is to register people to vote. A third really important role that we encourage people to do is to sign up to be a poll worker in your state, in your county, or in your city, your municipality where you live, because each polling location is staffed by folks just like us who take time out to help to staff those locations and ensure that everybody that shows up who's eligible to vote can vote there. And then the final role that trained volunteers can do is to do that work of educating your community and answering the questions that folks may have. So what does that really look like? Here, I'm sure that folks, that y'all are really the experts, and I'm just describing things that you all do every day for your work. But having a welcoming environment where everyone feels valued and invited, and then you can give the folks that are going to volunteer with you or work with you the clear structure and role for how they can help serve their elections in their community, and provide some clear lines of communication of a point of contact within your organization, a person who is responsible for distributing the educational materials that you'll have. And again, for the welcoming part, again, I'm sure I'm saying things that everybody here knows, but gathering together in person is a great way to start some of these efforts, preferably, with food. Setting the tone with the expectations for the accessible roles that people can have to take on with a little bit of orientation, and then assigning those responsibilities that not everyone needs to do everything out of those volunteer roles that I described, but everyone can do something. So there's a role that anybody involved in any of your organizations can do to help ensure that we have free and fair elections this year. We would suggest, again, kind of a common organizing structure here, but just to set goals around what you're doing and decide how you're going to make those decisions at the local level for who will be educating folks in your community, who will be registering voters, who will be talking about what's going on with the election rules in your area, and break those down based off of people's preferences and skills. And then what does it look like to have people that are trusted messengers to talk with your neighbors? Here we would suggest, and why I have tools to offer each individual who's on this call, and we do future trainings, is to communicate early about topics that folks in your community may hear about. And we have a lot of tools to do that based off of research that we do that I'll describe in a moment. But I'm sure that folks on this call have expertise of your own to share based off of your experience in previous years, your experience with previous elections, sharing that as early as possible so that folks feel like they're equipped with something, and that you speak from the heart from what those experiences have been like. Even one thing I want to share about, why to do this communication in your community early on about the rules in elections is that what we found in our research, where we go out and talk to people from all walks of life about how they think about elections, what matters to them, what concerns or questions they may have. And what we find is that even among people that have pretty high confidence in our elections, that they believe that their ballot is going to be counted the way they cast it, and that the winner is legitimately the winner of the election, even among people like that, there are seeds of distrust that can be a threat to them, either not believing that their vote will count or not believing that they can trust the outcome. And so we would urge that we can't dismiss those questions or criticisms, frankly, of the structure of perhaps the government or how elections are run, that we should meet people where they're at with those questions and seek to answer them in good faith. And people we found in our research are open to be persuaded about whether to trust the election process or not, that they prefer to get a chance to verify, to prove any accusations or allegations that are made over a more directly emotional or, partisan appeal that many people in the media will be making around election season. So I would think that, folks like y'all are really kind of the perfect folks to be talking with your neighbors about this, so that you're not coming at it for, partisan reasons. You're not coming to persuade them to make some case to them about it, but rather just trying to answer your neighbors' questions about what's going on. How to do this, a little bit of the how-to is, We have found in our research that local election officials can really help, and we can help connect you with them in really just about any state. We work with many of those folks on a day-to-day basis to help convey the truth of how they run elections and make them secure for all eligible voters. And having one of those local election officials really helps convey that message in our experience of working directly with voters. The second is to set uh, expectations and talk about verified elections. So again, not telling people you should just trust our process, but rather explaining the checks and balances that we have and setting people up with clear expectations of what they should see in their community. Finally, we found in our research that many people, they understand the motivations of some public figures to perhaps misrepresent for their own reasons to stay in power what's going on. But that motivation alone, knowing about that motivation, is not enough to persuade people to dismiss allegations. We need to show other sources of information so that they can verify any questions that they have. Finally, just some key phrases and frames that we found from our research. Again, as you've heard me saying, talking about the checks and balances, bipartisan teams of people at every stage of the process who assess the conduct of the elections, waiting for evidence and verifying facts that we hear, sticking to those facts over our feelings or our own preferences of what we might have wanted to have happen in that election, looking for proof, not just accusations, and things like unity, values over division, and putting our country over any partisan preferences that we may have as individuals. One of the ways that we do this is by equipping organizations that have, again, a cross ideological membership to have the tools to do this. And so one program that we can provide to everybody on this call going forward is this program, Trusted Neighbors, where we will introduce you to a local election official, introduce you to some of those communication tools and resources that are tailored to your community. We can tailor some of those resources with people in your community. And then equip your members or people that you serve to be those communicators of how to start a conversation with a neighbor who has a question and what you can do to be a civic narrator in your community as well. I want to just briefly share here that we have these state-specific trainings to offer detailed educational tools, and that what we do is partner with folks, and something we can offer is community between your organizations at the local level and other kinds of nonprofits that are educating voters and doing nonpartisan civic education work. That one of the things that we found is it can be good to know that you're not alone, that there's a set of other folks in your state doing this. If you're not already connected with those people or groups like that, we're happy to provide that bridge and to have those types of sessions that equip people in your organizations to get a chance to meet others that are doing similar work. So let me maybe stop there with sharing my slides, because I wanted to leave a good amount of time to go into a couple of the other tools that we have, and just share a little bit for the context of why I think it's so important that, and I'm so grateful for each of you in hosting this conversation to do this work together. I'm going to share one other thing that, again, is in the Zoom chat, but I'll just show so that you can see what it is that I'm talking about. And that is our election risk heat map. We believe that it's very important for people across the spectrum and throughout many different walks of life to be doing nonpartisan civic education about elections this year, because there are three factors that are really coming together, and you can see the local details here of where this is happening. One is that there are vulnerabilities in state law that could allow a bad actor, someone who is seeking to manipulate an election outcome. There are vulnerabilities in state law that could be exploited. And we combine that analysis of the state laws where there are potential vulnerabilities with where there are individuals with a track record of seeking to overturn election results that they didn't like. And then finally, where there are very close races that could be decided by a small enough margin that they would be vulnerable to manipulation of those local ambiguities in state law. So you can go on to this tool and see what this looks like for many of your states. It doesn't cover every state. So it doesn't answer necessarily every question that folks might have. But if you click down to the state level, there's a detailed analysis of, what's going on, knowing where Kamatara is coming from, of like, you can see a full state level analysis of what is going on in New Mexico, the reasons for different assessments of what's happening in that state, and therefore some of the types of topics that you may want to communicate with people in your community about. So that is a little bit of the why and the how, and then I'd love to maybe just pause there and give folks a chance to share other topics of concern or questions or programs that you've run in your states or with your organizations, and I can respond to those with some of the tools that are available for folks to deal with those topics.
Thanks, Evan. That was really helpful. I'm looking forward to digging into that tool. I'm curious, I can see that Lynette Poverty Solutions Group, you wrote in the chat that Florida is creating huge barriers for ballot initiatives which quell the voices of voters, particularly in a supermajority state. I'm curious what some examples are of those barriers, and Evan, if you have some examples, or if Lynette, you want to write a little bit more in the chat about that. Like, what are we keeping our eyes out for? Like, you showed some of the threats, but what else do you think about that? And just to add a few thoughts from the New Mexico folks here, because I am in Las Cruces in southern New Mexico. I know a lot of folks are very concerned about what happens when you go to vote on the actual day of voting, and if ICE is going to be present or anywhere nearby. So there's some concerns about safety in New Mexico, but yeah, I'm curious about those barriers.
Well, one thing I can share just for folks that have concerns about safety, if that's come up in your community, there's an organization that we work with who has a lot of resources to offer in that lens. So it's called the Democracy Protection Network. Put that link in the chat, but democracyprotectionnetwork.org. And they provide a range of a few things to groups that range from physical security to cybersecurity to legal advice and representation and crisis communications. So if you're considering whether your organization is comfortable, for instance, having a voter registration forms available in your offices, or doing a voter registration drive, or talking on your social media about the rules for registering to vote in your state. If you have any concerns like that, or you think that someone may come into, say, a clinic you operate or a center for services that you operate and could pose a challenge to you, the Democracy Protection Network exists to provide resources to groups who are in that situation. I'd also just plug briefly that one of the things I mentioned earlier that really, I would encourage folks here to engage on if you have members or are willing to do this yourselves, is to be a poll worker in your municipality. So I just put a link in the chat to do that, we partner with an organization called Vet the Vote on doing. And this is valuable for a couple of reasons. One is to learn about that process yourself, but the second is to be able to speak about it, having gotten experience of staffing the polls in your town or city. You are then the perfect person to explain what's going on to people that you're speaking from direct experience. So would encourage folks, if you don't do that already, to have folks sign up and be a poll worker in your community. And just seeing that, yes, like for instance, in Florida, there have been recent legislative changes that dramatically restricted the rules under which people can do, organizations can do voter registration drives. And so for questions like that, that's why we have the state level guidance and advice that we can offer to people based off of the rules in your particular state.
All right, it looks like there's a question from Ariel. So can you unmute there? So close. There we go. Well, the hand is down, but you're still muted. I do know that a lot of our chapters, especially our chapter in Florida, they have done a lot of voter registration and even specifically poll working, like learning how to work the polls. And it was incredibly empowering for people who haven't engaged in democracy before and or just, you know, to understand how it works for the first time ever. So, Ariel, are you able to unmute? All right, it looks like there's another good question there in the chat. Evan, why don't you go ahead and take that?
Yeah. So just to voice that over, that if folks want to support participants' civic engagement, but worry about that being perceived as or crossing into partisan territory, what are the practical things that organizations can provide to assist with that without crossing into anything that could be either perceived as or actually be viewed as partisan activity? Um, uh, so one thing I should just very clearly give as a caveat, this is not direct legal advice to any organization, and I'm not an attorney representing any firm that would be representing you. But general guidance, as someone who has run voter registration drives myself, the most important thing you want to do is provide your material from nonpartisan sources. Any election office in your municipality can provide those tools and resources. They're linked in the link I just put in the chat for nonpartisan voter registration opportunities in every state that will route you to asking those questions. And as long as you are providing tools that don't come from a partisan source, that don't say you should vote for this candidate or this type of candidate or this type of person, as long as you're doing that in general, then you should be protected from those types of allegations. But it is a question that I really appreciate folks asking, and that the other thing we would say of why we have this program with trusted neighbors to bring people together from different communities is really that's just about other folks knowing who you are and knowing your work, knowing that any allegations that are made about you of something that you're not doing as nonpartisan groups are just not true. And so having that broader community of people that are all doing nonpartisan civic engagement work know you, you get to know them, and you have broader solidarity among similar organizations is one of the things that I think all of the great networks of groups that are on this call provide, but that certainly we can be a helpful partner in doing too in different states for those coalitions of groups doing that work.
That's definitely where relationships come in to be that foundation for supporting each other. And also, I'm sure, organizations have nonpartisan guides that are really clear. And there's so many nonpartisan organizations out there that provide voter information. So it's not overly difficult to get to that information. I'm really curious if you have any pro tips, Evan, about, as we're meeting in community with all different people, because being, anti-poverty or working on homelessness, like we are bringing people together across any difference you could imagine. So we have the whole political spectrum in the room when we're in the field. So then, do you have any pro tips when, let's say, the conversation just either gets heated or it turns very partisan with our volunteers or our community members, and we need to bring us back into the land of nonpartisanship. So I don't know if you have any from your experience or your resources, how do we redirect our folks that may be a little off?
Such a great question, and such an understandable thing that people really care, have strong beliefs. And one of the reasons to participate is to see that change that they want, that their view is respected. What we would encourage is to ground any of your work and discussions for a volunteer or a participant in your voter registration or education work in the values at the outset of that we're coming together for a nonpartisan effort to ensure that everybody who is eligible knows how they can register to vote and they can vote in their communities, or come together to staff the polls to ensure that we have enough people to serve the voters in our town or our city. And just coming back to that value purpose that's shared across difference in those most heated moments is just one tactical thing that I would suggest that we found helpful to return to. Just seeing maybe a couple questions in the chat of, is it okay to offer program participants the opportunity to register to vote, such as during the program enrollment process? So an important caveat there is it does depend on your state law for how voter registration drives can be conducted, who can do them, if you are a professional employee providing those to people. So that's why the more detailed advice that we have is specific to your state and the laws in your state. So what I'm about to say is just general guidance that will vary state to state, but I can share that in general, many states allow people in nonprofit social service agencies to be providing voter forms to individuals who may be eligible. Some states have rules about where those forms can come from, or how you need to track them, or your contact with local election officials for how quickly you need to return those forms once they've been completed by an individual with filling the form out with you. So that's where there's variation in state law, is exactly how to do that. But as a general principle, it is extremely common for people to engage in the registration process when at a social service agency. The key thing I would just flag is it's very important to make it clear that their registering to vote is not conditional on any service that they're receiving from you or anything of value that they are going to get. That you're not saying, "Oh, I'm going to register you to vote you can register to vote if you X, Y, and Z, or you will get this benefit of a service from us if you register to vote. And if you certainly not to say, the worst thing to do would be to say if you register like this and then you will get, and if you vote for this particular person, you will get this service. That is the thing that would stray into partisan political activity and in some cases be illegal to do. So those are the things to avoid. And again, the specific things of exactly what is allowed is contingent on the state laws in your state. But that's what I can say at that level. Again, more details that I'm happy to provide to individual organizations based off of the state that you're in, and in some cases the county that you operate in as well. Um, and then I'm just seeing a question about ways to counter the impression that some folks may have that my vote doesn't have an impact, and specifically in historically disadvantaged communities that may feel overlooked. That is an excellent question, and I should say that we do not at our organization directly work with or try to turn people out to vote. That is not something that we do as an organization. So nothing that I share here is about our organizational goal of getting people to turn out to vote. That being said, it is a worthwhile thing to to engage people, and we provide tools for voter registration information, such that people can encourage participation in the process. That uh, what I would suggest, just based off of my experience in voter registration work, is that it's less about believing, that your individual vote is going to um, sway an election than that you are expressing your values. Whatever those values are, your decision to become a voter is a way to live those values. It's a way to represent them, to have them, be accounted for, to have people in positions of power have to reckon with the fact that there is someone with these values that is showing up, participating in the process. So again, different based off of where people are coming from or the things that they care about, but at the most general level of why be a voter? Why should anyone care if your vote is not going to determine the outcome, if it's not going to be decided by one vote? I would come back to what are the values that you have? How can you have them be represented? It's an expression of that.
That's a great answer. I also think of Reverend Barber and the Poor People's Campaign, where when you look at the historically marginalized folks, like what percent of the population is that? And if we all voted, what that might mean for how it impacts our lives directly. And I think there are some wonderful examples of races that were determined by just a few votes. And I know we don't want to get technical when people are saying, well, my vote doesn't matter. What's the point? That's where you can really dig into your relationship with that person and know which path of persuasion might be the best for that person. I love that idea of what are your values and how are you expressing them, and that just engaging with your democracy as a fundamental right in this country and of existing. It feels almost subversive. You're like, no, I am going to go vote. I'm going to do this thing. So that can be really, really powerful to have those conversations couched inside of the relationship that we have with each other. Well, are there other questions that y'all would like to put in the chat? I guess I get so curious about how those mailed in ballots get counted and how you know that they get counted because you just mail them off and you think, what what happens to them? Is there a verification process for that? How does that work?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And One thing that I'll say at the outset is just to put another link in the chat here, but that folks, you can learn exactly how that works in your state with our state level trainings because it varies a little bit state to state of how the ballots that are cast by mail, when they're sent out, who they're sent out to, how they're counted. But in general, what I would just say to anyone that has a question like that is that there are bipartisan teams of people just like us at every step of the process, from mailing the ballots out to checking them when they come back from voters to certifying the results of those elections. It's bipartisan teams of people just like us who do that work at the local level. That there are checks and balances at every step of that process, from reviewing the list of people who could receive a ballot by mail to checking the ballot when it comes back into the local election office to then reviewing them and the results of who people have voted for. It's bipartisan teams of local people just like you and me that do that work. And we have at every stage, people with both the structure and the training to do that on behalf of all eligible voters. And so, it's almost like a really good colleague of mine earlier today, even was sharing, like saying that, one of her neighbors would say, like, well, works on a submarine. And how many people know exactly how a submarine works? But you don't need to know how a submarine works to trust that, yes, the people that are doing that are well trained to do it. They've done it before. The structure and the incentives that they have, we can verify that they're going to do that job well. And the same thing is true for elections. It is complex in some ways of exactly how, like, a barcode is read on the mail ballot, and often people that are trying to confuse folks about how elections work will hang into those very small details about, like, well, I don't know, how do you even print a barcode, or like how does that work? And I would just come back to that at every stage of the process there are bipartisan teams with strong checks and balances to review and ensure that eligible voters are having their ballots counted.
That is great to hear. Every time I learn more about elections, I realize how little I know and that I have to learn more. So I'm really grateful for the resources you put in the chat. Are there any other questions before we come to a close? We have just a few more minutes, maybe time for one more question. I know that these elections coming up are really important, although every year is an election year, but we also know that, we are trying to protect our democracy here, and it's really important. And especially with nonprofits as direct service providers, we are on the front lines with people who would, could, should be voting. So, any other questions? Oh, there's a good one for you. Go for it, Evan.
Yeah, this is a great question. That laws and procedures can change frequently and vary state by state. What are the most common misconceptions that we've seen, and resources that folks can rely on to have accurate and updated information? That is where I would come back to the real-time tracking of those state laws that we provide, and the newsletter. So thanks to Maya for previously sharing that, but I'll just put, back in the chat those two tools, because we have broken down there what are the rules in your state, how do they compare to other states, and as they're changing, that is updated to provide folks with the latest information for the rules in your community. I'd also say that part of the reason why in our trainings that we provide to people based off of the state that they're in, why we connect folks with local election officials, is they often have really good tools of their own that are specific to your community that you can then find and stay up to date with. So we track it for the whole country, but Another great tool is your local election administrator. That's often the person for your county who is running the elections that can provide you with the latest information and, in some cases, answer individual questions for the program that you're running or the people that you're serving.
That is excellent. We're definitely going to grab that and get that to our entire community of practice. Well, we're at the end of our time here, so I'm curious, Ruthie or Kara, if you'd like to join in or have any final words, or, Evan, anything before we close. So, all right, Miss Ruthie, coming back on screen, and Kara, thank you so much. What
I
would you
just
like to
want to
add?
I want to thank you, Evan. These resources are incredible. It's funny, we're in Massachusetts where there is a great interest in voter participation and not as many barriers. So honestly, I just assumed that things were fairly the same around the country. So this was eye-opening. And I thank you for those resources and for your time. And I really thank everyone who joined us today in the middle of the summer to talk about this really incredible topic. And again, thanks to our partners for encouraging us to do this.
Echoing all the thanks to Evan and to all of you and everyone who joined. And for those Family Promise folks on the line, look forward to working with you and see how I could support you as our Director of Advocacy and in doing this work during tough times. So please reach out and look forward to more partnership opportunities between our three organizations.
Absolutely. So, Evan, do you have some final words to close us out?
Well, just thanks again for having me. And again, thank you for the work that you do every day serving your communities. The foundation of our democracy is people coming together in their local civic groups, and you're all doing that every day. So just thank you for what y'all are doing.
Thank you, Evan. And please make sure you catch the link in the chat from Maya that says to fill out the survey, because we really do value your feedback so much. And take care and make sure that you get out to vote.